Okay, so today I want to talk about a particularly controversial issue. I've covered it a few times before, but this is in relation to something that I've been noticing quite consistently. Incidentally, I'm not a heavy smoker if you're wondering about that. It's just a periodic thing. Okay, the issue I want to talk about is Palestine, to try and summarize it into one word. If you've been following world news, you'll know that earlier this year there was a brief but very bloody conflict in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. That was a very controversial conflict, and like is so often the case, Israel was vilified. Now, initially, my position on that conflict was, I won't say I was neutral because that would be misleading. I was taking the logic, well look, Israel is in a unique position. It finds itself constantly being fired at by Hamas. It has to respond. And any other country in the world would do so. So when I see pretty much any powerful country criticise Israel, I think that's hypocritical, because if especially if the likes of Russia or China were to be attacked by terrorists, do you think they would lay back? Of course not. Look at the way China has responded to the terrorist attacks from Xinjiang this year. They haven't held back. Russia certainly didn't hold back against the Chechens, and no Western country would either. So it seems hypocritical to me for for powerful countries, let's put it that way, for powerful countries to criticise Israel when they would respond in exactly the same way. But having said that, there came a point when I thought this has to end at some point, because far too many innocent civilians are being killed. And it's no good just saying, oh well, Hamas uses them as human shields, because that makes no difference to people who have seen their entire family wiped out before them. Now, Israel always goes out of its way to say that they warn civilians, but what sort of warning is this? Getting a shell on your roof as a warning, then a minute later or 5 minutes later, whatever it is, getting your entire house flattened. It may be a warning, but the problem is these people have nowhere to go. So Israel's warning them that they're going to conduct air raids, but where the hell are these people supposed to go? Gaza is a very tightly packed area. One problem I have with the Israeli position is they love to play the victim, and they always get very defensive to international criticism. Now, okay, most countries would, but Israel doesn't seem to quite grasp that when they kill hundreds of civilians en masse like that, okay, even though if those civilians are being used as human shields by Hamas, even if that is the case, you do not win international support by doing that. Now, the truth is, there is international support for Israel among most Western governments. And no, that is not a Jewish conspiracy, which is what some people believe. And actually, that's an issue I want to address. That support is because those governments recognise that they cannot be in a position where they say Israel can't defend itself. And in part, especially in the case of Britain, we helped to create the modern state of Israel. So it would just be hypocritical. There's a few issues I want to address. I don't want to go into all the rights and wrongs of this conflict, because I do believe it's very complex, and it's particularly a depressing conflict because whilst it is very, very far from the world's deadliest, it's not even close. In fact, among contemporary conflicts, it is not even in the top 10 deadliest contemporary conflicts. I'm talking about people killed per year. I don't mean to be technical about lives, but if you look at all the conflicts in the world today, there are many that are a lot deadlier than this one. And yet this one, far from getting ignored, I think it gets a lot of attention, which I find rather surprising. Now, not surprising that it gets attention, but there is one fact that is surprising. Wherever I look, where there is a BBC report or CNN report, and it could be on any subject, it could be about the unrest in Ferguson, it could be about Obama's immigration reforms, it could be about 2 Polish builders being killed in a balcony in London, it could be anything. Wherever there is a report about something that has no connection with the Middle East, someone, usually an Arab person, comes and says, what about Palestine? Often in big block capitals. Now the insinuation here is that these big networks ignore Palestine. That is something I really take issue with, because it is just not true. When the Gaza conflict was going on, we heard nothing but Gaza for the duration of that conflict. Even though the war in Syria was ongoing at that time, what we heard was Gaza, 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 Gaza. Now of course it is a newsworthy thing, it is a big, big story. 2,200 people killed. In fact, this was the deadliest conflict in Gaza ever this year. So it was a major story, there's no doubt about that. But this idea that it is ignored is utterly rubbish, because it gets a lot more attention than, for example, the conflict in South Sudan. Some accounts say as many as 10,000 people may have been killed there this year. It gets a lot more attention, at least in the BBC, than the Mexican drug war. So I really don't understand where these phony claims are coming from, and I do believe that it is, in part, an anti-Israel bias. There is unquestionably an anti-Israel bias out there, in which the sort of moral indignation against Israel is not used against other countries. An example of this would be the sort of anger from a lot of Muslims. Why is it so many Arabs and so many Muslims, I'm talking about everyone, but there is a tendency here, it's just, I'm calling a spade a spade. There is a trend for a lot of people from Arab countries and a lot of people who call themselves Muslims to show this indignation at Israel. And yet if you look around the Middle East, pretty much every regime there is totalitarian, whether they be absolute monarchies or run by another form of dictatorship. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Is it perfect? Far from it. But the fact of the matter is, Arab Israelis can go a lot further in Israeli society than minorities can go in most Arab countries, can go for in jobs in most Arab countries. So, some of the analogies, I saw a cartoon recently showing Uncle Sam, the sort of caricature of Uncle Sam, celebrating the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and behind him was the Israel Wall, and Palestinians sort of saying, what about us? The idea was that the West is hypocritical when it comes to the two situations, but the thing about that is, it's completely different, because East Germans were not vying for an independent homeland. They were not firing rockets into West Germany. You can't compare the two situations. I also have some reservations about the apartheid analogy, although I'm not saying that's completely invalid, because I mean Jimmy Carter is one of those who has put forward the analogy, and I have a lot of respect for Jimmy Carter, so I'm not going to completely dismiss that, but I just think that a lot of the criticism that is levelled against Israel can be found in many other countries, so I think it is extremely hypocritical. Also, you cannot condemn Israel's use of force and then completely turn a blind eye to Palestinian rockets. And by the way, these are not toys. Obviously, what the world sees is Israeli tanks facing off against unarmed Palestinian children throwing rocks. But that is not the whole picture. Very often, those Israeli soldiers show profound restraint, actually. And I know that. I have seen the videos. Okay? If they were the monsters that the world makes them out to be, they would just go in and kill everyone like that. And they don't. But let's be clear, that it's not just rocks that the Israelis are dealing with. They're dealing with lethal rockets that can kill people. And the only reason we haven't seen mass Israeli fatalities is because of the Iron Dome. Now, before I continue, I need to say at this point, people are going to dismiss me as a stooge of Israel and so on. Absolutely in no way am I suggesting that the state of Israel is above criticism. And in no way am I saying that Israel is entirely innocent. There have been episodes in modern Israeli history that are absolutely morally unjustifiable. For example, the shooting of journalists, the shooting of unarmed Palestinians. There's many examples of also collective punishment is a common accusation made against Israel, that all Palestinians are being punished because of the actions of Hamas. Now, the Israelis may say that they give warnings to the Palestinians, but like I say, these people have nowhere to go. So there's a few things I want to raise. I really don't want to get into the ins and outs of who owns the land. By the way, I think that as soon as you start arguing that point, that Israel's on illegally occupied land, etc., it's a phony point, because Israel is not going to go anywhere. So trying to make any sort of argument from that starting point is a bit like saying America shouldn't exist because Europeans colonise the Americas, killing native Indians. It's a similar argument, and it isn't going to go anywhere. History is full of injustice. History is full of moral wrongs. But if you want to solve contemporary problems, you need to deal with contemporary issues. And that, frankly, doesn't make any... Arguing the rights and wrongs of the foundation of Israel doesn't actually make any difference to Palestinians right now. The most important thing for them is their living conditions, security for both sides, and peace. Now, the reason the Middle East is so depressing, this particular conflict, it just never seems to end. Even after the Gaza conflict, we've had the recent clashes in Israel, in Jerusalem. 10 years from now, I hate to say, we'll probably be seeing the same thing. It's very hard to be optimistic about this part of the world when there's been so many letdowns. I don't think Israel is ever going to tolerate a situation whereby Hamas continuously threatens them. Well, the purpose of this video is not to suggest any sort of answers to the conflict. Likewise, I don't think the Palestinians are ever going to be interested in peace so long as they see their entire families wiped out by the state of Israel. But I do want to talk about the hypocrisy that I'm seeing. Now, if those people are Palestinians, I completely understand their anger. But if they're from other countries, especially a country like Pakistan, or Indonesia, or Morocco, I'm thinking there is plenty of conflicts much closer to where you are that you can be showing interest in. Yet there seems to be this obsession about the Palestinian issue. Now, why is that? Why not the Kurds? Why not the Rohingya people in Burma? Why is there not the same sort of concern about those people? So I do think there is something that doesn't quite add up here. People love to come up with conspiracy theories about Israel. Well, maybe if there's any conspiracy theory, it is a conspiracy against Israel. If there is any conspiracy theory. Because the sort of moral indignation that is levelled against Israel is not... There is not the same level of concern shown in other parts of the world. Now, this is not a case of being sycophantic to Israel. I am not. Let me make this very clear. Again, and I have to keep doing this, because unfortunately this debate is so polarising that people automatically get pigeonholed. Just because I'm saying Israel has a right to defend itself, just because I'm saying that arguing about Israel's existence is a phony point, doesn't mean that I'm uncritical of Israel. Some of Israel's actions aren't only immoral, they're stupid, because they only isolate Israel. I don't particularly like Netanyahu. I think he's a hawk. I don't think he's particularly interested in peace, and I think the settlement building is not only impractical, it's immoral. So at some point, Israel is going to have to work with the international community, not always go it alone. And that way they would get a lot more sympathy for the self-defense issue. I mean, Hamas has very little credibility in the international stage. In fact, most Arab states don't even support Hamas. Which is why there was limited condemnation from Arab governments. In Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan was trying to take a moral position, which is hypocritical. This is a man who presides over a country that denies its past, who built himself a palace where many Turks are living in abject poverty. I have very little respect for Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. I think he's an opportunist of the worst kind. Incidentally, Israel could equally level that claim against Turkey's treatment of the Kurds. So I really think Turkey's in no position to lecture Israel. And yet, again, that's the point. Why is it there is not Muslim anger towards Turkey for their treatment of the Kurds? So I get very frustrated with the massive double standards when it comes to Israel. So when I see people coming on to news stories that have nothing to do with this and saying, what about Palestine? I'm thinking, get yourself out of a bubble. This issue has been covered exhaustively. You can go and comment on that on a video about this issue. I'm going to have to round it up there because it's coming to the end of the bandwidth. But another unfortunate side effect of this is a massive rise in anti-Semitism across Europe. And that's unfortunate because blaming Jews, all Jews, for the actions of Israel is completely wrong. Many Jews abhor what Israel is doing, actually. Jewish people are a very diverse group of people. I'll go have to leave it there.